sex! Now that I have your attention, what we'll actually be talking about in this video is the history of sex in video games. Yeah, I wasn't kidding about the sex thing.
Even though sex is perfectly natural, we today seem to have a much more puritanical view of it when it comes to it appearing in our media, especially in comparison to how we talk about violence. Like any human interaction, sex is much more complicated than hitting X for sex.
So I want to open up a conversation about sex in video games, to discuss the ins and outs, as it were. And because I'm immature, I'm going to make a lot of innuendos like that one while we do it. Also like that one that I just did there. Yeah, there's gonna be a lot of that.
So let's dive into a brief, though hopefully not too brief, history of sex in gaming. Sex has been around gaming since the start of the medium, because if human beings are gonna create something, we're gonna find a way to put the old bedroom rodeo into it.
Wow, I really can't say Huh. Well, finding YouTube-friendly ways to say will be a lot of fun in this video. Let's just say for now we're talking about the old pixel pushing.
One of the first and most prominent games to feature sex was 1981's text-based adventure, Soft Porn Adventure for the Apple II. In the game, you play as a down-on-his-luck party animal trying to win the affection of several women.
And while that sounds like fun, the game wasn't great in its depiction of women.
With the game featuring things like long descriptions of how tight a girl's butt looked in jeans, or lines like, "She's taking a large sausage-shaped object and looking at it longingly."
As if women get simply hypnotized by looking at a sausage-shaped object.
Soft Porn Adventure sold 50,000 copies, an absurd amount considering the Apple II's install base was only around 200,000. Sex soon came to the Atari 2600, which makes sense because, have you seen that thing's controller? Games like 1983's X-Man, which sadly was not a Wolverine sex game, drew inspiration from classics like Adventure, where you play as a naked man running around a maze to avoid floating scissors and bats.
Oh, you know, we all remember that part of sex, right? Just me?
If you complete the maze, you have sex with a pixelated woman, and I'm not exactly sure how to censor this. There were also games like Beat 'em and Eat 'em, which I can't show you uncensored images of, but guess by the title what it was.
As all of these games illustrate, the early 1980s were marked by a tenacity and willingness to put sex into gaming, coupled with a general inability to do it with any level of sensitivity.
These are just dots doing the no pants dance with other dots at best, and degrading depictions of women at worst.
But dang it if we didn't try to make it happen, for better or worse.
At the very least, early attempts laid bare the stumbling blocks developers often collided with. First among them being how sex was seen as a climax, every pun intended there, a reward for beating the game.
Sex became like what achievement trophies are today. Increasing gamer score. Almost as satisfying as sex.
Even further, that reward was often sex with a woman, underscoring another trend. How the game's protagonist was usually assumed to be a sexually active straight dude. This dominance of men as the protagonist of games also underscored the predominance of men behind the scenes making games. There was a lot of barriers at the beginning of programming and computer science that kept a lot of women out of being able to make games, which in turn informed a lot of the games that were being made being targeted mostly at men. All of this led to the assumption that only straight men played games because only games were being made for and by straight men, which wasn't true. That being said, there were some bright spots, with games like Nightlife, which aimed to be an aid to sex life for couples, even containing an early version of a period tracker for women and depictions of sexual positions for couples to try.
Even further though, depictions of sex often ventured into problematic territory, and one of the most severe and notorious offenders of this was in 1982's Custer's Revenge,
where you play as General Custer and force yourself on an indigenous woman that you're supposedly quote-unquote saving.
It's a deeply dehumanizing and awful depiction of indigenous women and sex. As a result, the game gained notoriety upon its release, with many women's rights and indigenous groups protesting the game and pushing legislators to outlaw it. The game's publisher, Multiple Industries, even leaned into the controversy, doing things like previewing the game for indigenous groups before its release.
The object of Custer's revenge is for Custer to cross over a desert obstacle course and reach the Indian maiden and make an impression on her.
What do you mean by impression on her?
As you can see, the games do have a little sexual action.
Yet, while the protests were growing, many who took issue with the game were quick to point out that their issue wasn't with the showing of sex itself in a game, but with the dehumanizing depiction of women and indigenous people through sex.
So graphic, in fact, that Indian militants like Lois Red Elk have gone to the duplicating machine to print flyers by the hundreds protesting the rape and racism of Custer's revenge. Lois, this flyer is pretty strong stuff. What offends you most about the game?
Let us suppose that it is a Hitler character attacking a Jewish woman. Would the Jewish woman be smiling?
The controversy around Custer's Revenge eventually grew to include other sex-related games from the company like Beat 'em and Eat 'em, leading many to blame Atari for the games, despite Atari having nothing to do with the creation or publishing of the game. This led to Atari itself to respond to the controversy, with Atari's Consumer Electronics Division president Michael Moon saying that, quote, Atari takes a very dim view of this use of our product, but also arguing that, quote, to say that Atari is responsible for this occurrence would be as illogical as censoring a camera company for making cameras because a few people take pornographic photographs. Eventually, though, the pressure led Atari to sue the game makers, leading Custer's Revenge to be pulled, but not before the controversy had led the game to sell over 80,000 copies, twice as many as multiple industries' next sex-based title.
All of these issues that we've been talking about, as well as the taboo nature of discussing any form of sex in general in the United States, would soon come to a head as gaming gained more mainstream attention.
Should Custer's Revenge be treated like a book? That means anything printed, anything goes. Or should these cartridges be controlled and regulated like any show you'd see on commercial TV? Well, stay tuned. Probably the next episode will be shown in court.
The gaming industry survived its market crash in the mid-1980s and continued to grow into the late 1980s, so too did the market for sexy video games grow as well. For example, 1987's sleeper hit Leisure Suit Larry was a direct adaptation of soft porn adventure. In the game, you play as Larry, a comically inept man who tries to pick up young women. The game was so successful that it spawned a cult franchise, which had its most recent entry released all the way in 2020.
This period also saw the release of games like Cobra Mission, the first Japanese adult game to be released in the United States.
Yet gaming was also starting to become more mainstream, with more and more people playing it, and as a result, more attention being brought to it. And as a result, that brought with it tighter control over what could be portrayed. And sex was often the first thing censored. By the late 1980s, Nintendo had dominated and pushed the US gaming market into the mainstream consciousness with its NES console, and as a result, also created content guidelines for games on the system,
as they didn't want the sex-based controversy that Atari had been embroiled in to happen to them.
While Nintendo allowed some graphic violence, nudity and sexuality were strictly prohibited. Nintendo of America went even further, heavily censoring nudity in the American market. Ness in Mother 2 was given pajamas in a dream sequence when he was naked in the Japanese release, Final Fantasy VI characters were given more clothing, and lines referring to babies and breasts in Chrono Trigger were altered. This all contrasted with Nintendo's rival Sega, which had a much looser policy on violence and sex. Despite being behind in the market, Sega sold more copies of Mortal Kombat on its Genesis system over Nintendo because it allowed the blood to stay in the game, leading Nintendo to let Mortal Kombat 2 do the same. Sega even published Night Trap in 1992 on the Sega CD. Night Trap was an FMV game with players trying to save teenage girls from vampires and featured some, interesting scenes? Sega does what Nintendo don't, indeed. This patchwork of guidelines eventually led to moral panic surrounding video games.
Well, if you look at what they represent, racism, violence, pornography, militarism, all the worst kinds of things in society which we would like to eliminate. So I think that they're very detrimental.
This all came to a head in 1993 when the United States Senate held hearings on video games. The hearings, led by Senators Joe Mr. Peabody Lieberman and Herb Kohl, focused mostly on Mortal Kombat's violence, but also Night Trap's sexual scenes. often forgetting to mention or straight up mischaracterizing the game as being about sexually terrorizing women, not the fact that the goal was actually to save the women.
What is particularly troubling about the scene in this film that we have an extract of is a graphic depiction of the violence against women with strong overtones of sexual violence. I find this segment deeply offensive and believe that it simply should be taken off the market.
The moral panic surrounded the aesthetic of sex in any form, not the nuances of issues with how it was portrayed, and it reflected the United States' often puritanical feelings towards sex in general. All of this led to the creation of the ESRB, with the video game industry, like the motion picture industry before it, choosing to self-regulate itself rather than having Congress do it for them. And sadly, this self-regulation had more universal repercussions for sex over violence. While violence could sometimes garner a game a T or M rating, it could still be released. Comparatively, any explicit depictions of sex were given the dreaded adults-only rating, and console companies like Nintendo and newcomers Sony and Microsoft would refuse to publish AO-rated titles.
Despite changing views on sex within the United States, there's still a taboo nature around it in any discussion of it, and as such, censorship hasn't really gone away, it's just changed. While the US government has become less focused on censorship, at least in the video game area, as our censored dots earlier in the video showcased, even being able to talk about sex on places like YouTube is difficult. I mean, even here on this platform, I've even had to censor 3 pixels representing genitalia, like literally 3 dots. That's all they were. That's all that genitalia was in Custer's Revenge. But if I say that these 3 dots represent genitalia, we have to censor them. If we don't, this video might get demonetized or age-gated here on YouTube. All of this shows how market forces can often censor videos without someone explicitly saying to do so. And this becomes relevant for our video when we discuss companies like Microsoft or Sony or Nintendo and their refusal to sell sexual-based games on their console marketplaces, when it's a normal part of an adult's experience that can be depicted healthy, safely, and naturally. However, by consistently making it a taboo subject within our culture, it's given a sense of mysteriousness and grandiosity and often becomes misunderstood. And that often leads to a lot of our sometimes repressed views around sex within our culture today. However, even beyond that, there are other implicit biases that can influence how sex is depicted in media and gaming, especially in the United States.
Games that did feature sex that were released were often more juvenile. Games like Duke Nukem or Conker's Bad Fur Day were filled with semi-naked women. Or flowers, if that's your kink.
She's lovely. That's why the wife kicked me out. All I want to do is pollinate her. Oh, she's got stigmas like you wouldn't believe.
Now, don't get me wrong. I am not above a good juvenile pollination joke if you catch my, spores. But games didn't really evolve much beyond this for a long time.
There were some games that, as the medium matured, began to handle sexualized themes with more complexity and maturity, such as the psychosexual horror game Haunting Ground, that explored how its lead protagonist was sexualized as a woman by society around her using horror tropes. However, even in these more complex stories, the emphasis was still often placed on how attractive a stereotypically beautiful cisgender woman was, even when these games are trying to explore, deconstruct, analyze, or even empower female characters.
We could even see this in games like Tomb Raider becoming infamous for the size of Lara Croft's, dual-wielding assets, if you know what I mean. And I'm not talking about her guns. Lara Croft may have raided tombs, but she also raided my sexuality. Throughout the late 90s and into the early 2000s, games became more focused on experimenting with complex narratives, with gameplay having become more standardized over time. And one element that came along with these more complex storylines was giving the players agency in choosing romanceable partners. Developer BioWare was at the forefront of this, as it added romance options to its story-focused games like Baldur's Gate 2 and Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic.
I love you. There, I said it. I do, and I don't want you to become a god.
While these romances only typically contained allusions to sex within their stories, they proved to be widely popular with fans. Yet, as BioWare writer David Gator articulated, there was an interesting reaction to these romanceable options from fans.
I found, in particular, the reception for Animan to be, the one male romance to be quite interesting. Since he was the only one of the 4 that was sort of targeted at female players, there was a perception among a number of the female players that was unfair. And they said, like, why don't we get an equal amount of romances? Why did male players get such a variety from which to choose and they didn't? And at the time, it really seemed like our only response could be that, well, that wasn't, it's not about fairness, right? We're developers, we have resources we need to allocate. Content is incredibly expensive, so, I mean, even my response at the time was, well, we were looking at who would get the content versus the size of the player base. I mean, as far as we knew, we barely had any female fans, so it seemed, you know, how awesome we were. We thought we were being generous.
All of this is because, throughout gaming history and the history of most media within Western culture, there was this underlying assumption that gamers were mostly men. But this also was because most people creating games were also men themselves. And this is because of the long history of bias towards women being able to enter the programming and computer science spaces. And a lot of this bias and implicit sexism ran deep throughout the industry.
For example, scantily clad or not clad at all women were commonly seen throughout gaming. You even saw this outside of games themselves, but in the real-world gaming industry.
Even look at E3, which was meant to be a professionals-only event at the time, yet was dominated by booth babes, women hired to dress scantily to attract attendees and sell the games at the show. What I'm essentially describing right now is the issue known as the male gaze. Many of you have probably heard the term male gaze, and maybe even have a colloquial definition for it to discuss how women and others are objectified. Yet, the actual idea of the male gaze is a bit more complex when we look into it. It's not just objectification alone, and that's actually the problem and the complexity with the male gaze. It's actually about this complex relationship between the person making the game, the person they assume is playing the game, and the game itself, as well as the actual audience that plays the game, and how all of those things treat anyone outside of the assumed identities and viewpoints of those the game is made for as something alien, different, and other, strange, or weird, or something fantastical to look at. We all play games and watch media to have an experience beyond our own that is different from our everyday lives. As a result, if the creators of a work of art, games in this case, are mostly straight men, and they assume because of this that the audience is primarily also straight men, it leads the game to take on the viewpoint of straight men. As a result, anyone outside of that identity within the game gets to be seen not just as an object, but as an other, as something different from the person presumed to be the one playing the game. And it's this otherness that is the incredibly important factor when we discuss the male gaze. Who gets to be seen as an other, and whose viewpoint gets to be assumed to be seen as natural and normal, the viewpoint that we take on most of the time within media. What gets to be seen as the default viewpoint.
This then informs how the game views them, and while it's not only in sexual situations, it's most notable when it comes to sex and desirability. Take for example how the camera in Mass Effect 2 originally lingered on Miranda's ass in some scenes. The camera wasn't a perspective shot of your protagonist character, but the shot was angled that way specifically to signal how sexy her ass was to the presumed straight male audience who would enjoy it. Thus, the camera itself took on this viewpoint intentionally. Shots like this also showcase how women are often less shown in full shots, highlighting specific body parts, segmenting them, instead of taking them in as full people. This also goes to how characters are designed and move as well within the game, with many games featuring women that wore tight or no clothing and moved in a more sexually provocative way. This relationship between the people making the game, the presumed people who are viewing the game, as well as the camera itself, all is what we're talking about when we say the male gaze.
Further, all of this affects how we view desirability and sexual attraction. Conventionally attractive women, usually white, curvy, and big-breasted, are seen as spectacle and desirable, and everyone outside of that is seen as, well, frankly less attractive. It leads to this assumption that anyone outside of this dichotomy, like LGBTQ folks, people of color, or women with different body types, or disabled people, or numerous other types of people, are undesirable.
This isn't to say women being sexy is inherently bad, as characters like Bayonetta show you can have a character whose sexualization is part of her story. It's not even inherently bad to view women as sexy just for sexy's sake. It can be an end unto itself.
The problem actually is the ubiquitousness of that viewpoint, which is often centralized in straight, cisgender white men. It's not saying that that viewpoint is inherently a bad thing. In fact, you can make many great works of art from that viewpoint, which is why I like so many of them. But the problem is that so much of our art and culture treats that viewpoint as the default in all of our media, and as a result it becomes to be seen as the natural and normal viewpoint. Yet, in reality, that viewpoint is not the only viewpoint that exists. By normalizing this viewpoint, it creates an often unconscious, but still common, bias that seeing women solely as objects and hypersexualized is not only okay, but the natural way to be. Instead of saying that it's one way of many that women can be seen, and also denies women the ability to have equal chance to possess agency within games, or more directly relevant to our discussion on sex and gaming, to also be the ones to possess the ability to see others in games with the same desirability that men get to look upon women with in most games. There can be a variety of f***ing for all. Or choosing not to f*** if you're asexual. So slowly, at BioWare at least, this implicit bias began to be recognized and addressed, with games like Dragon Age and Mass Effect adding more romance options outside of the main romances for straight male characters. And there were actual sex scenes, the ones that were tastefully done, though the romance with male partners often cut out before the actual sex. And many more games around this time, like Heavy Rain or Assassin's Creed, also began to include sex scenes and romance options. Yet even this wasn't without its problems and controversies. First and foremost, Mass Effect itself drew criticism from many Christian and right-wing organizations like Fox News.
It's just not good, and I'm definitely not going to let Mass Effect in my house.
Another controversy kicked off after the creation of the Hot Coffee mod for Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which let gamers with some know-how access a previously inaccessible sex-based minigame that was part of the game's code. Since the content was actually part of the initial game, the controversy forced the ESRB to change the game's rating to adults only, eventually leading again to another attempt by the United States government, this time led by Hillary Clinton, to attempt to try to argue for federally regulating video games.
Today I'm announcing, along with my colleagues, Senator Lieberman and Bai, the Family Entertainment Protection Act. This bill will prohibit the sale of violent and sexually explicit video games to minors.
And the Federal Trade Commission even investigated Rockstar and Take-Two Interactive for not divulging the content in the game.
But even if we move beyond the moral panics, there were still issues here. Liara, for example, was depicted as a monogendered species in Mass Effect, which was awesome. Yet despite this, all Asari like Liara were all represented as stereotypically sexy femme-looking aliens, still catering to the male gaze that looks upon certain aspects as conventionally attractive in women. Though to be fair, who doesn't love Liara? Second only to Garrus and his sexy calibrations.
Calibrating a giant gun is a vacation.
Sex was still the culmination of your romance storylines in all of these games, with it being treated as the end goal and reward at the end of a romance storyline rather than a natural part of a relationship and something that can happen at any point during it. In real life, sex can happen on the first date or years down the line, multiple times, just a few times, one time, or not at all at any point.
Overall, this era of gaming began to show signs of growing maturity for the industry. It started to address some of its long-standing biases, yet still perpetuated others, all while dealing with going from a niche culture to a mainstream artistic medium. While imperfect, this shift in sexual representation had an effect. As gaming entered the 2010s and 2020s, studies showed that more women and other marginalized folks entered gaming as they saw more options that appealed to them. It also led to an increase in women behind the scenes in developer roles as well, leading to more diverse games overall. But as new perspectives began to be represented, pushback against this grew. Because the male gaze had been so normalized, as the industry begins to include more perspectives in the games themselves and break out of that mold, some begin to feel that this means that their identities, which had previously seemed ubiquitous, were being vilified or pushed out. When you're used to seeing something only one way, new perspectives can sometimes appear like oppression or antagonism. Yet this isn't the case. We still have many male protagonists and still enjoy playing as them, but just wish to include more voices in the creation of and in the games themselves. Yet this has led to some unacceptable pushback. For example, some fans balked at the less sexualized appearance of characters like Horizon Forbidden West's Aloy, or the more robust body type of Thor in God of War Ragnarok. Just because someone is bigger doesn't mean they aren't healthy or fit. And even if they weren't, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be represented. And also, who doesn't love Fat Thor? He's Fat Thor! We love Fat Thor here. We stan Fat Thor here.
Sadly too, these outdated viewpoints are still sometimes reflected in game development spaces as well. For example, Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed Odyssey was going to have the female Cassandra be the only playable lead, but Ubisoft's marketing team and creative lead sadly wouldn't allow it, saying women don't sell games.
And all of this is sometimes caused by many cisgender men feeling like they're being vilified for wanting to be in a gaming space. That's certainly and sadly often the narrative that some will take away when watching videos like this one, where someone like myself, a trans woman, or anyone else, especially from someone whose viewpoints don't often get shown in media, try to talk about these issues. But I, and many of us, are not here to say men are bad, but we're trying to say that the anxieties surrounding expanding diversity often get weaponized for darker ends, and that we need to have better education and discussions surrounding these issues, and also, more importantly, less adversarial conversations. This isn't about me versus you. It's about all of us coming together to have a welcoming discussion about these issues. Kind of like what I'm hoping this video will be.
All of this may seem off topic to discussing the act of sex in games, but it's important context. That's because, while these issues are prevalent, the increase in diversity in all areas of gaming has led to great developments in the showcasing of sex in gaming itself.
Games like The Last of Us Part 2 have featured lesbian protagonists, for example. Further, similarly, Last of Us Part 2 showcases how many games don't feature sex as the end goal of a story, but as part of it.
While also simultaneously showing women of different body types, like Abby's more muscular build, to also have sex scenes. We're also seeing more representation of asexual people, such as in The Outer Worlds.
Games have also begun to feature more complex discussions of issues surrounding sex, like Boyfriend Dungeon's discussion of stalking and abuse. No more pollination jokes. Though, I'm still here for those. And while there's still no shortage of hot and sexy ladies, men are also getting in on the sexy times, like The Witcher 3 Geralt's infamous bathing scene, which allow men to show a different side of themselves and also be sexualized. It's all about finding a balance, allowing identities to slip between the desirer or holder of the gaze and the desired, the one gazed upon, instead of it only being in one direction from one certain type of viewpoint, with women always being seen as the objects of desire in that situation. And we're getting better at depicting that. And there's still so much left to explore. I mean, we didn't even talk about virtual reality and how people have found sex in those spaces, alone and with others. Oh yeah, that is perfect. I swear I'm not looking at anything inappropriate in this thing. We also didn't talk about things like consent or depictions of sex workers in gaming. We also didn't talk about things that only games allow us to do, like play with our identity. So I hope you're open to the conversation as we continue talking about sex in video games, both on this channel and in other places.
As we attempt to go under the covers and see how gaming today can continue to improve and grow, just like it's always done since its inception.
But speaking of the future, I've got to return to my, let's just call it Half-Life Alyx gameplay. Yeah, we'll go with that. So until next time.